video is Unit 2. We'll begin our discussion on photosynthesis now. Photosynthesis is that reaction in which plants or animals like them can take this energy from the sun and with other chemicals like CO2 make food. So we'll look at a couple of basic concepts concerning that before we get into the fun parts of photosynthesis. One of the most basic concepts is the organisms that do photosynthesis are called autotrophs. Auto means self, troph feeding, so these are self-feeding organisms. Plants are the ones that we most commonly think of as being autotrophs, but there are others. Algae is an example. Algae is not a plant, it's a protist. And so these also are able to do photosynthesis, as well as really small organisms called phytoplankton. Phyto means plant, so these are plant-like plankton. And there are even some bacteria that can do photosynthesis as well, even though they don't have a lot of the same structures that a plant has, like a chloroplast. They still are able to do photosynthesis. Heterotrophs are organisms that cannot do this. They depend on other organisms for their energy. They have to consume other organisms in some way, like these orangutans eating the leaves. They're eating those leaves for energy, whereas the leaves can make their own food. Fungi are another example of heterotrophs. Sometimes they are confused as autotrophs. They do not make their own food, but they break down dead organisms in order to get energy. One of the primary structures in photosynthesis, in eukaryotic cells at least, is called the chloroplast. The chloroplast is composed of several parts, and so I'll just draw a little chloroplast here on the side so you can see. There's a picture of one right there beside it, but it's a little small. And so the chloroplast is a membrane-bound organelle. It has a double membrane and has its own ribosomes, has its own DNA, much like the mitochondria. And inside the chloroplast are these little discs. Each one of these discs is called a thylakoid. And these thylakoids are where the light-dependent portion of photosynthesis is going to take place, on the membrane of the thylakoid. A stack of these thylakoids is called the granum, and the space on the inside of the thylakoid, the liquid on the inside, is called the stroma. And the stroma is where the light-independent reaction, or the Calvin cycle, is going to take place. There's a picture of the chloroplast. Again, the chloroplast's job is to take in the sunlight, to absorb the sunlight and use it. Here's a chemical reaction for photosynthesis. A couple things to note here. Just that, and I've used the colors to kind of show this. It's not, it doesn't really work, but it kind of works. So you can see that the CO2, the carbon in the CO2 is converted to this glucose along with the oxygen, and the H2O is also split up. And so this just shows that idea of the conservation of matter. And then you see heat given off as well, because we know that any transfer of energy there's a release of heat, because those reactions are not perfect. I'll go ahead and show you both sides of this picture. This is the Calvin cycle at the top, but the one on the left is the light reaction. This picture is very important for understanding the overall reaction of photosynthesis. A few things I want to point out. Again, on the left-hand side, you have the light-dependent reaction. Light-dependent reaction. It's called that because it depends on light, and you can see the light interacting there with the thylakoids. And water is going to go into this reaction, and that water is going to be broken up, and the electrons from that breaking up of water are going to be captured by a chemical known as an electron carrier, which is this NADPH. We'll talk more about NADPH later. And the energy from that reaction is also going to be able to create some ATP. And so these two products here are the most important products of the light-dependent reaction. They're going to be the vessels that the energy is contained in until it is put ultimately in the sugar. And notice that oxygen here is given off as a byproduct. In the Calvin cycle, or the light-independent reaction, light's not needed, but these two molecules here, this ATP and NADPH, they're going to be utilized, and you can see that here as they are used up. And they are used up along with the CO2 that goes in, inorganic CO2, and that is converted to sugar, an organic molecule able to be used by living things. This making or taking of an inorganic molecule like carbon and making it into an organic molecule that's able to be used is called fixation. So in this particular case, we have carbon fixation, like before we've had nitrogen fixation. A little bit about the light spectrum. Sunlight is often referred to as electromagnetic energy, and this energy is high quality energy, meaning that it has a very low state of entropy. It is very good to do any kind of cellular work as long as those cells are equipped to process the light energy, like plant cells with chloroplast, for instance. And light is measured according to wavelengths, and you can see here this spectrum. We have all the way from purple to red, and then you have some things on the spectrum that are not visible, where gamma rays and X-rays are on the short end of the spectrum, short wavelengths, and then radio and microwaves on the long end of the spectrum, the longer wavelengths. And the longer wavelengths have the least amount of energy, and the shorter wavelengths have the most amount of energy available to them. All of these light, or all the visible light together, makes what we call white light, and that's the whole Roy G. Biv rainbow idea. And light is going to travel not only in wavelengths but also as particles called photons. So that makes light a little bit odd in that it's a particle and a wave, but it's one of those things that is true, and we accept it even though it may seem contradictory. And the important part about how light works is some of the light from the plant, or from the sun, let me come back to this one, is going to be used. Some of that light is going to be reflected. I think it's important to understand the difference here. The light that is used is absorbed. The light that is reflected is not used. All right. The light that is not used is reflected back out into the atmosphere. And so when you look at a plant and that plant is green, what you are seeing is being reflected back to you. And so in that way, the green portion of the spectrum is not being used by green plants. All the other parts of the spectrum are. And so you can kind of see that on this picture. The green light is being reflected, everything else is being absorbed. Let's see if I can find a better picture. Here we go. This graph demonstrates that chlorophyll is the green pigment in plants, and so it's the portion of the plants that's going to be reflecting green light. And so if you look at the chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, we'll talk about the difference in a moment. Chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B have a high rate of absorption of the blue end of the spectrum, and the high energy end of the spectrum, and also a good rate of absorption of the lower end of the spectrum, the lower energy, the long wavelength. But notice the amount of reflection, or the amount of absorbance that's going on here in the middle. Zero, because it's reflecting it. It's not using that green light. It's reflecting it back out, which is why you then see green because everything else is being absorbed. Here's a picture of the chlorophyll molecule. The chlorophyll molecule has in it a magnesium atom, which we'll talk about on the next lecture. But again, it's important to know that chlorophyll is this molecule that sits on top of these structures called photosystems. Photosystems are just groups of pigments. I'll show you a picture of some photosystems here. It's not very good. This is better. The photosystems are these proteins on the thylakoid membrane, and they're there to absorb the light, and they have chlorophyll and other pigments on top of them. And it's also important to understand that there are other pigments besides chlorophyll. Here you have chlorophyll A and B. Chlorophyll A is the main pigment found in plants. Chlorophyll B helps chlorophyll A receive sunlight, kind of funnels it into chlorophyll A. You have these other pigments that are called accessory pigments called carotenoids. These are like your oranges and reds and yellows. They absorb those ends of the spectrum. And all of those pigments are contained then on these photosystems, photosystem 1 and photosystem 2. You have easy names, but unfortunately we're going to see, just like this picture shows, that they are not in the correct order. Photosystem 2 comes first and photosystem 1 comes after it.